feasting week is drawing to end. For some, it is already drawn to a close, depending on, when you started. And at the end of Passover, many of you know, if you've been in this space, or you've watched this channel for a while, that we do a Passover reflection. So I'm not going to do the Passover reflection as a whole here. You may be able to go down to some of the older videos or information and find it. But on Patreon, the Passover Reflection Journal will be posted. And within our small community, we will get together and we will begin to unpack what this week was. But I thought it would be cool to kind of go over some of the things from this week that were like really, really highlighted, but specifically from today. So shalom to everyone that's jumping on. I hope that this week was introspective, that showed up in the areas that you needed them to, and in the areas where you still need work. That's why we're here. So this week was a week. It's always busy during Passover because you have friends and family and people come in. And then if you're a person like me who is a introvert, who has extroverted qualities, when they're in front of people, you get drained really fast and then you spend a lot of time recharging. So this week I really went all hard and all in the beginning, and toward the end of the week I needed a lot of rest and solitude and reflection. And so that's kind of how my week has been going, and I'm really easing back into my normal everyday pace. So that's been good. So there's a couple of things that came up during this Passover. So for most of you, you did the whole deep clean. You've heard it probably passed around online, so I'm not the first person to say it, but really during this time, it's spring. We've moved into spring. We've passed through what we call the spring equinox, which signifies spring. And then our feast comes 14 days after the new moon that falls after the equinox, or on, or close in proximity, based upon how your watchers and everybody in your community decides to carry forth. And so there's a necessity of cleaning. And so it's so interesting that within the Pesach and the Passover, and in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and of course first fruits that all run in this week, you have it set up to do some purging and some cleaning. So this morning I had a thing on my mind, because I know, whether we like to admit it or not, whether we want to confront these things or not, this feast and all the ones probably subsequent until Yah does the full refining process are never perfect. And a lot of times when things are not perfect, we enter into a state of depression, despair. We're brought low because we're trying to achieve perfection in a practice, but it's through the practice that we actually get into the perfecting process. And so during this feast and after it, we have to know, and I have to know, not just y'all, but me too, that getting leaven out is a practice and is a principle that is instilled in us, not for just this week, but that we should be focusing on all year long. It's an all year thing. I made a post on Instagram, and on my Instagram post I said, people can be leavened too. And it's interesting because during this week, the process of introspecting and Yah dealing with us should be easier, because not only were we supposed to get the physical leaven out, but we were supposed to get the spiritual leaven out, so that as we interact with one another during the feast days, it's supposed to be a more pleasant experience, because we're not carrying the things that would cause us to rise or to puff up. We talked about at the beginning of this feast that chametz can be found in the heart. And most people think about the heart in the emotions and in the blood pumping source in your chest. But those of you who have a Hebraic understanding, you know that the heart is also considered the authority within. What is in control? What is driving you? And if you guys have listened to any of the other lessons, and as I begin to upload that Jeremiah series, you'll get a lot more information on the mind and how the mind works. But the mind operates in this area called the subconscious. Most of what we do and most of how we interact and most of what we feel comes from deeply bedded subconscious information that drives our conscious experience. And when we don't know this, then we're in a state where we're doing things and we don't know why we're doing them. And so when leaven is found, we can't just put it in it can't just be what comes up when we begin to just think. It has to be searched for spiritually in the lev, in the deeper recesses of the mind that really only Yah can expose to us. And so during this season, I realized, as I sat back and as I observed and as I had to engage with other people, that me and others still had deep recesses of leaven. And I know that that's true, but it's always difficult to deal with because the scripture teaches that a little leaven, just a little bit, no matter where it's found, can leaven the whole lump. And when those things are not dealt with, then it affects everybody in the collective space. And so as we move out of Pesach, and as we move out of unleavened bread, and as we move out of first fruits, I don't think we should see this feast as a ending of anything, but an opportunity that we had to learn practical skills and practical ways to dig deep, to listen, to be introspective, to be mindful, to be vigilant, to watch as we move through the rest of our year. Because there are things with a new lump that Yah wants to do, that if we let that new lump become corrupt as we move through the year, if we let the new lump sour, if we let the new lump take on the disposition, or if the old pieces then get into the new, then it's not new anymore. It's not new anymore because the old will take over. So one of the things that always comes up during this feast too, another one, not just one I've said like 12 times, but another thing that comes up during this feast that's very interesting to me is the reality that yeast is all around us. So the practice at the beginning is to be mindful about ridding it and then be mindful about watching it. So then the second half, if you will, of the carrying over of the practical information is to be mindful of where it is when it begins to come back in. Because after today, for most of us, and probably yesterday for some, and probably before for others, once the admonition and once the commandment is removed, once the staying of the yeast is lifted, then it's allowed back in. And what happens when it's allowed back in is that it's all around us, but then spiritually, physically we can have it, right? We can eat bread, but spiritually we're not supposed to allow the same malice, the same wickedness, the same ability to poke, provoke, puff up, to overwork, to whatever all those things are, to have hatred and to have a hard heart. No, we shouldn't welcome those things back in. But what makes it increasingly, no pun intended, increasingly difficult is that now people have left the work of watching for their leaven. And because they're not under, or they believe they're not under, the close inspection of the Creator, then when those things come back in, we don't check them in the same way that we would have checked them during the week of being in the presence and being in a space of introspection. So our job post unleavened bread, after we've been unleavened, spiritually, is to seek to remain unleavened. Seek to remain unleavened, because our job is to be like Hamashiach. There's no leaven found in him. There's no leaven found in him. So if our job is to be like him, is to be like the bread of Shamayim that is nourishing and is supposed to be transforming a person's life through the nutrients that are in us, because we're supposed to be carrying on as image bearers, the likeness and image of Yah, and be a reflection of Hamashiach, then in that process, it caused us to still have to look at it. And the reality, and if we could be completely honest, a lot of us got that physical leaven out, but we realized that the internal leaven that was in us and in our hearts was very much activated during this time. Whether we immediately realized and put it down, because that should have been the process, or whether it was there and once it turned on, we couldn't turn it off, we now know that leaven creeps in, and especially in two ways. Leaven needs a host, right? Yeast has to thrive on air, on things that can breed more yeast, just like sin has to thrive in an environment that breeds more sin. And Yah showed us the practice that we can be mindful and we can get rid of anger, malice, resentment, and all these things if we do it according to the way he said. And in doing it, it doesn't always feel good, because it's not until we know something is leaven that we're able to rid it. So it's through the process and having Torah and understanding what we're supposed to be doing through a physical process of removal that gives us better insight onto this spiritual process. Because a lot of us, unfortunately, knowingly or unknowingly, kept the Passover with leaven, because we didn't realize how deep in the deep recesses of our minds and of our hearts, literally, that leaven was. And so at the end of the feast, being a time of rejoicing, it's also a time of presenting back what we learned. That is what a Hebraic learning community does. We don't just say, whew, I made it, let me go get a donut, let me go get some whatever you want to eat that you haven't been able to eat all week. The true process is then presenting what we've learned and what we've grown in, and then asking Yah to then help us to increase in that knowledge and in that introspection. It's not a feast. None of these feasts, by the way, are feasts we just move on from. It's very interesting that we have three, but we have two really big gatherings. The third is, of course, or the middle one is Shavuot, where we come together. And when we come together at Shavuot, which is 49 days plus one, counting from, with the counting of the Omer, when we come together, we should not have, in 49 days plus one, entered back into a state that we were already in. There's a purification process before we actually receive in the practical practical sense of the feast, before we receive before our ancestors received the law. So with that being a reality, then we still have work to do moving to the next, which is a traveling feast, the next feast of gathering. And then we literally have, before Sukkot, we have another space of introspection. We have another space of introspection, and that's Yom Kippur. These spaces of introspection are supposed to help what the environment looks like and how we interact as we gather together. Because all of it is for the kingdom. We're all going to dwell in a kingdom. We're all going to be before the king. We're all going to be in his presence. And so these feasts are practiced so that when we come together, we don't have to keep dealing with these same old, drawn out things. So my encouragement for us all is, as you pick up your physical bread again, that we continue to do the work and continue with the fine-tooth comb to remove and look at and examine and confront in love and in understanding the spiritual leaven we found, because that seems to be harder for us to rid than it is the physical. But once we have the mindset to be able to do, because it's necessary, because we're always in Yah's presence, and we want to continue to be allowed into his presence so that he can instruct us, admonish us, and then bless us according to his will and his word. It's very, very important. So as we seek to do that, we have to look at how our relationships between one another directly drive and are a direct reflection of our relationship with the Creator. We cannot say we love Yah and hate one another. We cannot ask for forgiveness and not forgive other people. That doesn't mean forgiving for an occasion. We have to deal with the tough feelings. We have to deal with the tough things. We have to have the tough conversations. And then we have to not take them personally, because sin is an offense against Yah. It's not what somebody does to another person. Although those things do hurt us, and although people's words do hurt us, the offense is directly against our Creator, because he set up the parameters for how we are to engage with one another. And so when we sin, it's first against Yah, and then we go to Yah and we figure out how to fix those things, removing ourselves out of it. Because as long as we keep that leaven in us, then every time we try to move past a situation or move forward or become a stronger community or build a stronger tomorrow for our children within this walk, it cannot happen because we're carrying old offenses that really we can't go back and fix. But what we can is have changed behavior moving forward. This feast has taught us to be vigilant, to be introspective, and to think about everything we take in and every environment we involve ourselves in. I mentioned it before and I didn't continue the thought, but the difficult thing about on this side is now leaven is fair game. Everybody can have it, and people are not necessarily checking for it like they were during the week when we weren't supposed to have it. And so with that being said, it reminds me of a verse that, a story, a historical account in the book of Judges. And Yah talks about how when he first told the Israelites to go in, they're supposed to remove all the other nations. Why? Because the nations and in their practices, and I'll use like this, their practices were leaven. You take in a little leaven and it's going to corrupt the whole thing. It's going to corrupt the whole environment. It's going to corrupt what Yah has set up. So our ancestors were supposed to be vigilant against it and completely rid out the land of the sin, of the leaven of the other nations. But when they didn't, and when it began to take hold, Yah said, you know what? Not only will you not be able to remove it, but now the responsibility is you have to live with people who are leaven and refuse to remove it, with people who have sin and refuse to remove it, with people who have idolatry and idols and hatred in their heart and refuse to remove it. But you have to still operate in a state of blamelessness, even if everyone around you is not. So the practice now is to remain unleavened in mind and ruach and spirit, even if the environment is leaven. That is master level. But when you have the master, and when you know the practical tools to be mindful and to watch and do not let it rise, it's not saying that the leaven is not going to automatically try to get in. Right? We know that from making our bread during this week. We don't just let it sit there. We make it quickly. We get over things quickly. We get things done quickly. We don't harbor on things. We don't take things personal. We make sure that our speech is not speaking leaven. We make sure that our environment is not giving leaven. And when leaven tries to creep in, we identify it and quickly eradicate it. That is our practice moving through the year. Yah doesn't have us do things to just start and stop them. This is not some kind of, fairy tale, fantasy, cunningly devised fable of a faith. No, we have to continue to keep in practice what we've learned so that we can sit before one another, but more importantly, sit before Yah and learn and grow as a community. I hate that I can't read the comments on here because I'm driving, but I can go back and watch them later. So I will check and see what people have said. But I really want you to be encouraged. Don't be discouraged when you try to do. In doing, you learn. It's in the not doing that you are in a state of violation and offense. You tried, you did well, and you learned something, and you're committed to continuing to carry the practice and to move on. I wish you guys an abundance of peace, love, joy, light, and all the wonderful things that are added to those who continue to strive to keep the Most High's commandments and continue to walk in his statutes. May you have an amazing day. Shalom.